From all accounts, my grandfather was a good man. From the stories that I've heard of him, he was always willing to help out, lend a hand to people in need. And this happened in the midst of his life. He grew up in an orphanage due to family financial struggles. Eventually went on to serve the military and serving his country. And then meeting my grandmother. And together, they had 10 children, raising them all in the faith, and teaching the children the importance of good values and how to be overall good people. And yet, despite all of his hard work, despite being a genuinely good person, my grandfather suffered at the end of his life. I remember having to watch him during his final years battle with Alzheimer's, and how he slowly got worse, slowly forgot people, and his health deteriorated. My grandfather was a good man who struggled for no apparent reason. Today, Jesus also shares with us the story of a man who struggled, the poor man Lazarus. Lazarus, by the scriptural account, hasn't necessarily done anything wrong. He is a poor man that is suffering. He doesn't have enough food and is unable to even get scraps from those having their material needs met for a meal. He would sit outside all day at the rich man's house, longing for scraps and going ignored by those who had the means to help him. We can picture the poor man that has nothing to eat, no water, nothing to drink, fresh sores that are bleeding, and dogs in his face, snapping at him, bugs flying around and pestering him. Sit with that image. This is the image, the problem of human suffering. The sickness, pain, the evil that is present in our world. And it can cause a disturbance in our hearts. And yet, despite this suffering, there is still hope. Hope in our gospel today. The hope comes from this one line said about Lazarus. But now he is comforted. Jesus communicates that Lazarus' story does not end in his suffering, but in his being comforted. In this gospel, what Jesus is revealing is that God is aware of and knows our suffering. Often the argument of suffering is used against our God and against our Christian faith. And as Christians, I think we do have a good theological and philosophical arguments about the problem of evil and suffering. We have good answers to them on an intellectual level. But instead of an intellectual answer, today, Jesus gives us the best answer in the person of himself. Jesus doesn't avoid this issue of human suffering. Instead, he takes it on directly. He communicates that God sees the suffering of the poor. He sees Lazarus' suffering, even though those who have the means to help Lazarus do fail to notice him. He goes unnoticed by those who could lend a helping hand, who choose to live in complacency, worried about their own desires. And Jesus says that now Lazarus is comforted, revealing that God has a plan to cause change and bring healing. Like Lazarus, God sees our suffering and pain, or the pain that a loved one is facing, and God's plan is to set it aright and bring about renewal. He has compassion for us and has come down in the person of Jesus Christ and shared in suffering with us, even to the point of his own experiencing of death in the person of Christ. Because of this, we can say that Jesus knows our suffering intimately and deeply. So this week, if you are facing suffering, share it to the Lord, with the Lord. Don't be afraid to cry out to him. And if you know a loved one who is hurting and you're struggling with that, intercede for them to God. Don't be afraid to ask God the question why. Why is this happening to them? Why this person? But do so in faith and trust in God's ways. Thinking back to my grandfather's life, I do not always have the answers. I don't understand why he had to face Alzheimer's or why this suffering took place in his life, but I do know that God was with him in the midst of it, and my hope is that he is now in the comfort of God. We can all hope that no matter what challenges we face, we can hold on to the fact that God is always with us and never abandons us, knowing that his plan is for all of us to enter into his comforting love, which can be partially experienced here and will be fully realized if we accept his love and offer of eternal life. Finally, each of us has an option in response to the suffering of others. The gospel is also a warning about complacency. We can either be like the rich man in the gospel who ignores the plight of others, or we can try to mirror Jesus and show compassion and enter into God's suffering with others, or offer up our suffering as part of God's redemptive plan in Jesus Christ, participating in his cross in some way, in the redemption of the world. Maybe we do this by staying up late and talking to a friend dealing with depression or anxiety, sacrificing some of our alone time or time for sleep. Or maybe it's contributing some of our financial stability to charity, donating a little extra to help those in need. Or maybe it's spending time visiting someone who is sick, someone who can't care for themselves, who needs a meal cooked for them. And in this process, we provide the hope and suffering that evil will one day be undone. Instead of falling into the trap of complacency, worrying about only our lives, our needs, we can enter into the work of compassion, being participants with Jesus who has suffered with us, and shows us that his plan is to undo all suffering, injustice, and evil, and that this will be undone through his resurrection, which conquers everything and makes all things new.